Each year at the Ethical Society, we organize our programs around a theme. Our theme this year is Building an Ethical Future, and in October, we are exploring the future of war. To speak to that theme, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dani Belo, who will give a talk titled Modern International Conflicts and the Risk of Democratic Backsliding. Dani Belo is a teacher and scholar of international relations, specializing in conflict management, diplomacy, and international security. He is an assistant professor of international relations at Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri, and a fellow in the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs in Ottawa, Canada. Thank you.
Story that we heard about the python was a rather appropriate jumping board, considering that I'll be speaking to you about some of the biggest predators of international relations. However, I promise that it's not just doom and gloom. For people like myself who teaches about international relations, who's been part of the policy community in Canada predominantly, we're very optimistic about international conflicts. And what keeps us optimistic is that we know that every war ends with diplomacy, without exception. The question then becomes, how long do we wait until we reach that inevitable point anyway? And that's what keeps people like myself going. So, the plan for my lecture today is to speak to you about modern warfare, the future of international conflicts, and specifically, it's working, excellent, and specifically how we as individuals are an inseparable part of what's happening on the international stage. Now, I will begin with a brief introduction, even though that has already been done on my behalf. My name is Dani Belo. I'm an assistant professor of international relations and international security at Webster University. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, but I completed my doctorate at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs in Ottawa in the National Capital Region. I also worked as a policy analyst for the Government of Canada under the government of Justin Trudeau. It was an absolute wonderful time for me to explore international issues associated with the Arctic region and Canada's northern territories. In terms of my teaching and research specializations, I am a specialist on international security, specifically looking at unconventional conflicts and wars. And this is what I'll be speaking about today. Also, I have a regional specialization, which seems to be rather increasingly appropriate today, which is the post-Soviet region. I'm a specialist on Russian foreign policy. I've done that since day one of my academic and policy career. During the Q&A session, even though I will not be directly addressing the post-Soviet region, I'd be more than happy to address any questions you may have about some of these challenges that we have heard about in the news and in other sources. So, first, I will start with the discussion on what are the main characteristics of international conflicts today. We will establish this idea of gray zone conflict, which is the dominant format of international conflicts today. I will then move on to a discussion of how does this format of conflict, which again is the dominant one in the 21st century, how does it impact democratic societies, especially liberal democratic societies like our society? And finally, and this is where I will leave you with more questions than answers, how do we actually move forward? International relations today are dominated by great power politics, which seems to be, at least with the naked eye, far above our level. But that's not actually true, because each and every one of us is a participant in what's happening in the world. And I will show you how all of us are participants and where our responsibilities lie to understand what international conflicts are about today And how do we, as individuals, mitigate or help mitigate some of these threats that emerge out of the great power political struggle? Okay? And finally, I would certainly like to hear your questions. So, let's begin with this preliminary examination of what international conflicts and wars looked like. Well, we started out after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, after 30 years of bloody war that affected Central Europe. We have moved into more conventional wars that we have seen during the Cold War and in the early 90s, where we have large forces formations on the battlefield, moving to achieve the desired political goals. Then, after September 11th, we saw a refocus of our foreign policy to something along the lines of counterterrorism, small-scale operations involving special forces, very targeted operations in pursuit of the defeat of international terrorist groups and their supporters. Today, our international conflicts and warfare looks rather different. We have decisively moved away from the era of large forces formations moving on the battlefield. In other words, what we're seeing today in Ukraine is not the norm. It's rather an anomaly. What we are seeing today is international conflicts taking place over the screen of a computer. It's taking place in the economic sphere, but what some might call trade wars. International conflicts and quote-unquote warfare takes place in media space, in the information space, on the internet, in news publications, on television, to a scale that we haven't seen before. And in this environment, we, as individuals, are also a participant, as I said. So why this evolution? Why have we moved from these top scenarios of warfare to the present and potentially the future? Well, there are a number of factors. First of which, the cost of war has increased substantially. The cost of fighting, the cost of direct confrontation has increased. In terms of the human costs, human lives, which we value very, very much, especially in liberal democratic societies, and in terms of infrastructure costs. Weapons have become exceptionally deadly, unlike any previous epoch of warfare in human history. And the innovations that I'll speak about in the next slide help us avoid a lot of these costs, while at the same time having a similar ability to pursue the political goals we want. Or not just us, but also our international adversaries, potentially. So the technological advancements, we see the arrival of cyberspace as one of the focus points of international conflicts. Weapon technologies, again, contribute to this increase in the cost of war. We see transportation costs declining over the last 30 years, enabling the movement of information, people, technology across the globe. Permeability of international borders to an extent we haven't seen before, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where it was no longer the Iron Curtain that was preventing the flow of people, information, technology, goods to regions that were closed off before. Clicker. Right. So, considering all of this, we have moved from this Cold War era of large conventional forces dominating the standoff between the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union, and the North Atlantic Alliance, with the focus being on the United States, to this new format of conflict that has emerged in the policy community and in the scholarly community, and something that I research on a daily basis. It's called gray zone conflict, which is this new format of international disputes that, on one hand, it is not the state of absolute warfare, but at the same time, it is not a state of absolute peace, because we know we have ongoing disputes that are perpetual in nature between countries in the world. So gray zone conflict, in terms of this intensity scale, is somewhere in the middle. And it can take on different forms, and it can take on different levels of intensity, but it never reaches the point of open warfare, or at least we hope it never does, right? So this is the format of conflict that we're seeing today. And as I mentioned in the early part of my presentation, this is the dominant form of international conflict. It is rare to have conventional confrontations. In other words, what we're seeing in Ukraine is a general anomaly. Again, technological innovation has become a driving force of this ability to conduct foreign policy and engage in wars and conflict without involving the conventional military. Ambiguities in international law is an inseparable part of conventional or modern gray zone conflicts. Why? Because how do we know what constitutes an attack if it takes place through cyberspace? If it's about propaganda, disinformation campaigns, effect on electoral processes? The North Atlantic Charter, which then gave us the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has Article 5. How many of you have heard about Article 5? Article 5, in its fundamental, rudimentary sense, talks about an attack, right, that would then facilitate self-defense on a collective scale. Well, what is that attack in terms of a threshold when we're talking about cyberspace? And this is where a lot of the work for people like myself only begins. At the same time, to make things even more complex, as if they're not complex enough as it is, non-state actors, militias, armed groups, people who are sitting in a basement in the middle of Siberia on a computer. The new focus of our battlefield. How do we address that? How do we go after these threats? Rather difficult. And this is where all of us individuals come into the picture. Gray zone conflict, because it does not involve only, or may not involve at all, the conventional military. All of us become involved in it. All of us are an inseparable part of gray zone conflict. It is a whole of society phenomenon. We're all participants. Gray zone conflict may involve hybrid warfare, meaning that civilian means of conflict engagement can be there alongside the conventional military, but in most cases it never reaches that threshold, and it is just non-military means that are at the disposal of national governments to go after the foreign policy outcomes that they choose. It is very different from the Cold War. Very, very different, because it is no longer just about the standoff of two large militaries and everything happens around that. It is most often just about non-military means of pursuing foreign policy goals. And to make things even more complex, gray zone conflicts, we don't know where they start and we do not know where they end. They're incremental and protracted in nature because they're such low intensity. So it's no longer a question about declaring war. Declarations of war don't happen anymore. And we don't know where these conflicts necessarily end. They're decades long, and they're perpetual, incremental, and protracted. Now, For my presentation specifically, I'd like for us to focus on the information space. The information space, which has become the new battlefield for international disputes, or at least a major component of that. What does that mean? Cyberspace, social media platforms, institutions of higher education. They become the focus of international foreign policy. Why? Because disinformation, public mobilization impact on the local political landscape has become, it's not something new, but it's the pursuit of those desired outcomes with other low-intensity means. Everything from social media platforms trying to affect local electoral processes, to swaying public opinion in favor of certain political priorities. In terms of cyber attacks, trying to shut down electrical grids. So this is the environment where we have to think, how do we deal with this? Have we been successful at countering a lot of these threats? No. But we're moving towards solutions. And again, as part of our Q&A, I will leave you with many questions about a lot of these subjects that I'd like you to think about. And let's have a meaningful conversation. So who is the perpetrator of all of these? And this is an interesting question. When we think about these information tools, cyberspace, the original thinking was not actually by the United States or its military scientific community or the policy community. If we look at the actual point of origin of a lot of these ideas and concepts, they actually emerged from illiberal, undemocratic, and authoritarian states, especially if we're talking about what's happening in the post-Cold War era. Why are they prioritizing all of these things? Because it's in their interest to proliferate illiberal, authoritarian, undemocratic ideas into liberal democratic societies, like Canada, like the United States, in Western Europe, and other places in the world. It is their, in fact, main priority. Because then we will have a political environment that is conducive to what they want to do in the world. And as I mentioned, these illiberal states, such as China, Russia, they thought about this well before we did. Specifically, gray zone conflict and this idea of unconventional forms of war. For example, in the mid-1990s, two People's Liberation Army officers wrote a book called Unrestricted Warfare, where they knew, or they foresaw, the future of warfare being such that international relations in general will be affected by disinformation campaigns, and they were looking at the early stages of cyber warfare, and they're saying, this is the future of warfare. This is where our investments should be. So when we look at China and its ability to proliferate ideas into democratic societies and its ability to be proficient in cyberspace on a global scale, this is not something new. This is something that they've been thinking about for the last 25 years. And it's in fact us who are catching up. Let's go into another concept, the idea of society subversion. In other words, trying to sway public opinion slowly, incrementally, over many decades. This is not something new either. In fact, this was developed as a concept, as a very robust set of concepts interlinked together, and that was developed in the Soviet Union. Yuri Bezmenov, who defected from the Soviet Union to Canada, in fact, put together an interview to one of the major media sources in Canada at the time, speaking about this idea of society subversion. You can actually watch the interview in full on YouTube. It's available. What are the steps of society subversion? How is public opinion swayed slowly over time? How societal friction is created and other related concepts? Rather fascinating. So we are, in a sense, catching up to ideas that have been around for a long time. And the question is, in what way are we going to catch up? And in what way can we put together mechanisms from the individual level all the way to the level of our national governments that we can prevent, mitigate such strategies? Now, interesting example that I'd like to point out, because all of this is rather theoretical. So I'd like to bring it to a very concrete example. And I decided to pick an example that's not Canadian or American, so we can be a little bit of arm's length away and assess this. So this is actually an example that I brought before the Royal Military College of Canada when I was presenting there to people with stars on their shoulders. But then my students found this to be incredibly fascinating, so I said I will go into the general public and speak about this very interesting example. So how does actual information subversion work? So this is a very famous example of a disinformation campaign undertaken by Russia in 2016 in Germany. So the story is of a girl named Lisa who went missing. That ended up not being true. But what happened is Lisa returned home after being missing and said that there was an assault on her by men of specific ethnic background. And keep in mind, 2016, we have the Syria civil war starting, and we have a large number of people moving from Syria to Germany. So what really happened? So the police in Berlin actually investigated this and found out that that's not true, that simply so Lisa was not doing very well in school and didn't want to come back home and report on her grades. The Russian media picked up on this and said that there was an abduction of this Russian-German girl, and this was actually true, even though the Berlin police knew that it was not true, and they proved it. The Berlin police filed a statement that whatever was reported on Russian media at the time was actually not true. That was taken further by the Russian media and said, well, the Berlin police force is actually covering this up. This is not the case. The German government is lying and the Berlin police is. Protests broke out in Germany on the basis of that, so that information has been spread into the German society through various media channels, first of which was Channel 1 Russia. Then, in tandem with that, Russian officials, what they call fanned the fire. At the national level, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia came out and said, this is a story that is absolutely true, the Berlin police is covering this, and we have to do something about this. Because this is unacceptable. In tandem with the media and public officials who were fanning the fire, more protests broke out, and ultimately it resulted in significant protests by the political party, by members of the political party Alternative for Germany, which is a right-wing political party. So hopefully you can see the interesting anatomy, what they call the anatomy of a disinformation campaign. How carefully orchestrated it is, how carefully and in a very calculated way, in a very precise way, information can just spread. And this is the type of disinformation campaigns that our society has to deal with and address in a meaningful way. So how do we move forward in a positive way? How do we as individuals, what should we be thinking about when we see all of this happening in our society? Well, we have option one, which is we can censor media space, right? So not allow the fire to be fanned. But then we're making a significant compromise with our liberal democratic values. Option two, we can make borders less permeable, which again brings up questions of democracy, isolationism. Do we want that? Or we can ignore the threats, so let them continue to run around. Is that an option? Or we can ask the more pragmatic question, how do we balance threat mitigation with our democratic values? And this is where I would like to stop and give you an opportunity to ask questions and comment on the material that I've presented to you. Hopefully I've left you with more questions and answers, because this is just the beginning of a conversation. These are the conversations that are happening every day, often behind closed doors. But it is our individual responsibility to know about these threats and understand how we as individuals can be a part of the solution to these. Because ultimately the solutions, and our policymakers understand that ultimately the solution comes from the individuals. National governments can guide policy, but information is consumed by us on a daily basis. Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here at the Ethical Society, and I look forward to having a meaningful discussion about this.
Thank you, Dani. I think it's important to note